behalf of Festival co-directors Namita Gokhale, William Dalrymple, and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, welcome back to JLF's Brave New World. All our 100 earlier sessions featuring the best writers from across the world, including Orhan Pamuk, Margaret Atwood, Peter Carey, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Jhumpa Lahiri, Howard Jacobson, Ian McEwan, and so many others. These are all available to view on our Facebook page, JLF LitFest, and on our YouTube channel, Jaipur LitFest JLF. Our official radio partner is Red FM, Bajate Raho. Our session today is a little bit of Stephen Fry. Stephen Fry in conversation with Anindita Ghose. Stephen Fry is one of the world's best-known actors and comedians. But when he arrived in Cambridge, he was a convicted thief, an addict, and a failed suicide, convinced that he would be expelled. Instead, university life offered him love and the chance to entertain. He befriended bright young things like Hugh Laurie and actress Emma Thompson. Here, Fry talks about his life and work with Mint Lounge editor Anindita Ghose as he tells the hilarious and compelling story of how he took his first step in the worlds of theater, radio, television, and film. Stephen Fry is an English actor, screenwriter, author, playwright, journalist, poet, comedian, television presenter, film director, and all-round national treasure. Fry has written and presented several documentary series, contributed columns and articles for newspapers and magazines, appears frequently on radio, reads for voiceovers, and has written 4 novels and 3 volumes of autobiography. Moab is My Washpot, The Fry Chronicles, and his latest, More Fool Me. For the Show Festival in Niagara-on-the-Lake, Ontario, Canada, during the summer of 2018, Fry gave 13 presentations of his trilogy of one-man shows. And I hope you all are exhausted just listening to all that he's done. Anindita Ghose is the editor of Mint Lounge, the award-winning Saturday magazine of the Indian business daily Mint. She studied to be a linguist and was previously the features director of Vogue India. Please do remember to comment and ask questions by typing it into the comment section, and Anindita will put these across to Stephen at the end of the show. In case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can find us on our YouTube channel, Jaipur LitFest. And of course, if we drop off, just hang in there. We'll be right back. Ladies and gentlemen, a little bit of Stephen Fry. Stephen Fry in conversation with Anindita Ghose. Over to you.
Thank you, Sanjoy. And hello, Stephen. It's good to be speaking with you 4 years after your first visit to the Jaipur Literature Festival. It was a great session, and I hope this one will be as well. So firstly, because the COVID lockdown is, top of everybody's minds, tell us how you've been dealing with the lockdown, where and what books have been keeping you company.
Well, I've been very fortunate because I have a house in the countryside in England, in Norfolk, on the east side of England, and I've been able to spend almost all the lockdown there, and that has been a magical thing. We've had a wonderful spring, a beautiful April and May, and so a lot of walking and listening to birdsong and all the things that seclusion allows you to do, and indeed, yes, reading and writing, and I've also kind of set up a little bit of a sound booth where I can get away with doing audiobooks and other such vocal work, which is pretty simple to do. So it hasn't been too much of a strain for me, to be perfectly honest. Naturally, one misses seeing one's friends, but my family all live in the same part of England. So I've been able to see my mother once we were allowed to go outside and visit people on the lawns of their houses and so on. So really, I have very little to complain about. You hear the phrase, don't you, that we're all in the same boat? But actually, of course, we're all on the same sea, but we're all in very different vessels on that sea. And some people are in very leaky little vessels and are having a pretty hard time of it. And other people, of course, are on super cruises. And it's like being, it's like luxury for them. And I'm sort of somewhere in the middle, or the higher end of the middle, with my good fortune.
So, Stephen, Sanjoy just, in the introduction, read out a list of, partially a list of everything you've done and what you've written. So it's not a surprise that is Stephen Fry writing another book? Is a very top Google search term, as I found out today. So, for the benefit of all those who've sent out that query, I'm just going to ask that to you. What are you working on right now?
Well, the answer is a very greedy 3, actually. I finished the third of a sequence I'm doing on Greek mythology. Right. And this book is on Troy, the Trojan War, the lead up to it, all the excitements, the judgment of Paris and the abduction of Helen and the birth of Achilles and all these remarkable stories. And then the war itself, including, of course, the part of the war that is covered, it's really only about 10 days, that is covered by Homer in his masterpiece, the epic poem, the Iliad. And my next book then will be the return home, the Odyssey and the Oresteia, as it's called, of Agamemnon's death and his children, and all the extraordinary stories that kind of bid farewell to the world of Greek myth. So that was very exciting, and I've just literally finished doing the audiobook for that. But also, when the lockdown started, this is so childish and silly, really, but I was sorting out drawers in my house where clothes were, which I hadn't seen for ages. And I came across 2 huge drawers full of ties, neckties, bow ties and cravats. And I sorted through them. There were hundreds and hundreds of them. And so I thought I'd post a new tie each day on Instagram and talk about it, because ties have like anything, if you put your mind to it, there is a cultural history that can be drawn out from an object. And a tie is a very personal object, literally. Of course, it goes close around someone's neck, but there are also remarkable histories of ties and how they developed and where they came from, and also stories behind the great fashion houses. For some reason, I found I had ties by Valentino, and
I've been following the hashtag. You have some very interesting ones.
It is strange. So anyway, the publishing world being what it is, as you well know, I got a request from my publisher saying, "Do you think there's a book in this?" Because it became very popular, this daily Fry's ties, as I was calling it, on Instagram. So I'll be putting together a book of that. That obviously involves some photographic sessions we haven't started. And a third book that I'm produced next year is I did a podcast series called Stephen Fry's 7 Deadly Sins. Right. And it's obviously a slightly hubristic thing to suggest that I have the weight to be able to pronounce on something as grave and interesting, as philosophically beguiling and as complex as sins. I'm certainly not a religious person, as many people might know, so it seems an odd choice perhaps. But it really comes from my thinking, which I'm sure is shared by most people watching, that the venomous atmosphere of the so-called culture wars that develops and has been developing over the past few years and intensifying and becoming more venomous, it was really beginning to distress me. And I thought, well, almost anything people write about is sort of a missile hurled at the enemy across the ravine, the ever-widening Grand Canyon that is opened up between all the different, whether somewhere inside there's a kernel of what we used to call left and right, nationalism and internationalism, holism and atomism. There are all kinds of different ways of trying to explain it, but we're all dimly aware that there is a kind of an opposing point of view from ours. But what very few people do is look inwards. Towards the soul, partly because if they do, they're likely to be religious, and you have to cleave to their beliefs in order to make sense of what they're saying. But it struck me that almost everybody, and this was a point the Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant made, is that everybody has an inner sense, like Jiminy Cricket in the Disney Pinocchio film, a little conscience perched on your shoulder that tells you that what you're doing is wrong, that you're guilty, that you've fallen short in some way. And there's a lot of self-dissatisfaction underneath all of it. Again, I'm no psychologist, but I think we all know that aggression is often the result of a self-doubt and self-loathing. and self-oppression and all the other self things. And so I wanted to just explore these 7 deadly sins, which are pride and avarice, lust, envy, gluttony, anger, and sloth, wrath and sloth. But if you say anger and sloth, then it makes a handy acronym, pale gas. So I did this series, and it seemed to go very well. It got an enormous number of followers and viewers, not viewers, listeners. It was a podcast. So again, I'm doing a book on that. So
great.
Those are my plans. Long answer, sorry.
Okay, no, I know, I'm sure the listeners are waiting to kind of get into your Cambridge days, and we'll get to that. But since you mentioned, this kind of online, the troll culture and cancel culture, and I think it's very relevant right now, especially because you are presently on a Twitter break. And you were one of the, very early adopters of Twitter. You were one of the very first kind of Twitter personalities as such, as in a personality in real life, but also a Twitter personality. And you've taken frequent breaks. I think there was a big one around 10 years ago when you said that you were really frustrated with this kind of public group think. And I think, and I'm sure you'd agree, in these 10 years, that's become far worse. People have become far more vicious. In fact, just last week, I wrote about this San Francisco-based UX designer who's proposed kindness tools on Twitter. So he suggests that Twitter has, a I made a mistake button and a forgive button to get users to start using tools to kind of think and be more empathetic. So, quickly, before we kind of move on to the more pleasant, lovely days, what are your thoughts on cancel culture, the whole troll culture, and how can one deal with it? Surely just taking Twitter breaks periodically isn't enough. So how do you really deal with it?
It's an extraordinarily good question, Anindita, and I wish I could provide a simple answer or a clear one. But again, I'm turning in on myself. I am as filled with fear as anybody else in not wanting to do the wrong thing. I have a dread of offending people. In fact, it's probably too strong a dread, but it is a strong dread. So I try not to lose my temper because I fear that I might say something that upsets people. But I also have a fury at things that strike me as being absurd and wrong. And I feel, there was a great film. I mean, this is going to sound so completely irrelevant, called War Games, a John Badham film with Matthew Broderick. You may remember it, about a computer that takes over the thermonuclear work of the American government and starts to prepare for a war because it thinks it's playing a game. Anyway, in order to stop it, they realize it doesn't understand one thing: futility. So it's a wonderful AI movie, actually. And so they teach it to play what Americans call tic-tac-toe, noughts and crosses, which, as you know, from a very early age as a child, you can never lose. You can, as long as you're being smart, you can, never lose a game of noughts and crosses. So it teaches it to the computer that plays and plays and plays, and then it stops and thinks for a while, and then stops playing the thermonuclear game because it realizes it's a similar game. And it comes up with this wonderful phrase on the screen: "Strange game, the only winning move is not to play." And that is my feeling about the cancel culture and social media wars. Parts of me, I hear J.K. Rowling, who's a friend. Do I want to come to her aid and speak for her? Or do I want to speak for my community of LGBTQ people without offending them? There's only one way to win this game, and that's not to play it. And that is cowardice. I completely appreciate its cowardice, that maybe if I was made of stronger stuff, I would hurl myself into the fray and to hell with what people thought of me. But I'm not made of that stuff. And so my move is not to play. And that's part of why I took a Twitter holiday, was a fear of saying something or reacting. Maybe one evening I'd have a drink and just type something foolish. Who knows? And also, just looking at the trends and so on was making me feel sick, literally physically sick. so I thought, and I can understand why people might say, well, if you're in a public position, you've got 13 million followers and you believe in things and you stand for things and you represent groups of people, whether it's people with mental health problems or people from the LGBT community, you have a duty to get in there, and that just, you are doing the equivalent of going off into a Montaigne ivory tower, or into some seclusion, into some rich person's paradise where you don't get involved in the dirt and thrust of this. And I can understand why some people might say that, but I hope they can understand that I have to live a life and try and be cheerful, and that I do my best to time it. And maybe things like, taking a break and occasionally doing something silly like the ties, and then something more serious like the 7 deadly sins, is the best way I can both contribute to some sort of talk about the way we behave and who we are, and entertain, which is the thing I most want to do in the world, and also keep my own sanity.
Right.
I think that's my answer.
Yourself, not just, your 13 million followers, you have a duty to yourself as well, I guess, self-preservation.
Yes, exactly.
Right. But, it sounds particularly tragic. I feel really bad for comedians or, stand-up comics who are emerging in this time, because so much of comedy, and, you started off doing comedy, is that thin line between offense and entertainment. So I want to ask, and it's a good seg to kind of go to the past. How do you think things would have been different if you were starting off, you, Emma Thompson, and you, Laurie, in today's day and age? Could you even do comedy? Could you really push the buttons? Could you do Blackadder, a little bit of Fry and Laurie? How do you be a comedian? How can you, in this kind of age of virtue signaling and people kind of taking offense as a sign of showing how engaged they are? How would it have been if you were starting today?
It's a really good question that I find it very difficult to answer. I mean, funnily enough, someone on Twitter a few weeks ago had posted a sort of clip, or it was longer than a GIF. It was a clip from Blackadder, and I just sort of noticed it in the stream going by, and I stopped to see what it was, and it had some relevance to something going on. But it was not particularly political, but there were a number of comments underneath from tweets from people basically saying, "Okay, boomer," i.e., you're old men, and what are these white privileged old men doing? That's not comedy. What was that about? And I can see, yes, fair enough. I mean, it was a comedy about men mostly, and it was about a kind of history that is locked into a certain view of our country with kings and queens and hierarchies. But I think the point about that is that is so interesting, and it's a very difficult one to get into at any real depth. But essentially, I grew up in the remains of a hierarchical world, and if we imagine that the opposite of hierarchical is a networked world, so that instead of there being levels, there are nodes, like right. as in the information kind of the language of Claude Shannon and of networking, and this is something that I funnily enough, I did a long extended university essay on this very subject in terms of Charles Dickens, in that he showed how the world of Victorian London was a network rather than a hierarchy. And a perfect proof of that, which is what we're living in at the moment, of course, is a disease which works in a network way, not in a hierarchical way. And the diseases break hierarchies. And anyway, the point really I'm making is that a comedy like Blackadder utterly depends on your believing in a hierarchy, because that's where the comedy comes from, those below mocking those above.
Right.
And indeed, sometimes making fun of those below. So in Blackadder, there's a character, Baldric, who's at the bottom of the heap and represents the peasant at the bottom. And there's a king or a general or someone who literally has power over life and death. And that's important in Blackadder. At any moment, he could actually have his head chopped off or be sent to be shot. And so there's this threat, and there's this childish enjoyment that people like me who grew up in a hierarchical world feel, which is mocking your teachers, which is doing impressions of the people so-called above you and refusing to accept that they're above you. So being a rebel, but you can't be a rebel in a network. You can only be a rebel in a hierarchy.
Right.
So part of the problem that my generation faces is that we think of ourselves as rebellious, maverick, progressive, and so on. But we don't realize that all the levels that we were rebelling against have melted away. And that there's a different kind of world of privilege and a hierarchy that's not expressed as a hierarchy, but within the network. And we're not really tuned to it. So we're a bit shocked when we're made to feel that our language or our approach is somehow not just old-fashioned, but almost offensive, because we've always thought we were on the side of the angels, and it doesn't make sense. When I was a boy, although I don't remember it, Lenny Bruce was in London doing comedy, and he was in New York with police in his gig because he was using certain words, and he dared use them, and he was arrested, he was imprisoned because he used words like cocksucker or whatever it might be. And on one famous show he said, "I'm not going to say that anymore, I'm going to say blah blah. Have you had your blah blah lately?" And he did the whole thing using little nonsense words or euphemisms instead of the swear words he wasn't allowed to use. And as he ended it, he said, "That's the filthiest show I've ever done." And
Right.
he was making a point about language. And now all those words that Tom Lehrer used, I can use in this conversation. I mean, I probably won't, because some people still might just think it's a bit strong. But generally speaking, there isn't one of those words. They're no longer taboo. And something else has replaced them. And if you're cheap, you can say, it's just no different. People are Puritans. They're just Puritans about different things. And the Victorians used to find this offensive, and then in the 60s, this was offensive, and now something else is offensive. It's just young people being Puritans, as young people always will be. They want to command the cultural landscape, and they want to define the terms by which we're allowed to live, and to hell with them. And I can understand why some old people will feel that. They just think, how dare you accuse me of being racist or sexist or transphobic or this, that, or the other. I keep my own counsel. I know what I feel. Don't tell me what I am and what language I'm allowed to use. And I can understand that, but I can also understand that there has been an academic since the French, the much derided so-called crypto-Marxist infiltration of the campuses. But, it was around the time I was at Cambridge that the Roland Barthes and Derrida and Lacan and Foucault and all these great French thinkers were absolutely the height of fashion. And there was indeed a famous debate in Cambridge about which was the old school against the new school. And amongst that, intellectuals like Judith Butler and so on, who were writing about gendering, this has slowly crept through into public consciousness, and we're aware now of far more different things about it, and phrases that used to be completely misunderstood, like cisgender or heteronormative and so on, are now out there in the general language, and you can't put that genie back in the bottle. It
Right.
can't be done.
Anyway. So going back, Stephen, since now you mentioned campus, it's good to move to your happy early days before Twitter was in the horizon. In your book, in the second of your 3 autobiographies, in the Fright Chronicles, you've written in depth about your first meeting with Hugh, how Emma Thompson introduced you, and it quite reads like the stuff of a great lifelong romance, how you met and kind of worked for the next few hours without having said hello. So could you speak a little bit about, in a way, both of you were really fortunate for meeting each other that early and forming that kind of creative partnership. So could you tell us a little bit about that? And also the fact that Emma Thompson was it was a trio. She introduced you and she was part of the group in the beginning, but then it became a duo. Do you regret that, or how did kind of that happen?
No, it's an interesting point, actually. Yes, when I first arrived at Cambridge on probation legally, I had just by the skin of my teeth avoided prison. We may or may not have time to go into that, but at least I was free, and I got into Cambridge. I got this scholarship to Cambridge, and I thought I'm going to be good for the rest of my time. I've sowed my wild oats, and now is the time to grow sage, as the old Churchill quote has it. So I wasn't planning to do much outside study, but there was this world of drama, and I saw a production in my first or second week, virtually, of Tom Stoppard's Travesties, and there was this girl in it who was so perfect that I thought she must be a professional actress who had been helicoptered in. And then I got to know, because we were on the same course of reading English and we were doing the same seminars, and it was Emma Thompson. And she just was like Athena, the goddess. She was just born fully armed with talent. And we became friends, and we were, in a play together, and I was doing serious plays. But I then wrote a play, which was a comedy, and it was based on my experience as an assistant teacher at a prep school in England in my gap year before going to university. And it was a comedy, a sort of dark, naughty comedy, really, called Latin. And Emma told Hugh about it, and he went to see it. And it was the end of our second year by this time, and I didn't know Hugh, but he'd been an oarsman in rowing. He'd rowed against Oxford, and that had been his whole purpose in coming to Cambridge.
The kind of person you wouldn't ordinarily like, an athlete.
No, exactly, as an athlete, exactly. But he had this gift, and in his second year, he couldn't row because he'd had mononucleosis, and so glandular fever, and so he'd been off, and so he started to do comedy. And in his third year, he had the choice of being president of this comedy club called the Footlights, or captain of the University Boat Club. And he claims he spun a coin and it came down in favor of the comedy club. So Emma came to me at the beginning of our third year. She came to my rooms and she said, "I want to introduce you to someone." So she dragged me off from my college, Queen's, to Selwyn College, and knocked on the door, and there was a shout of "come in," and I opened it, and there, sitting on a bed with a guitar on his lap, was Hugh Laurie, and his girlfriend Katie was in the corner making some tea or coffee or pouring some wine or whatever it was. And he went, "Hello," and I said, "Hello." He said, "I'm just writing a song." And he started playing this song that he was writing, which was a kind of mock protest song. It was very funny. So he said, "But that's as far as I've got." And so I said, "Well, you could try this." And we started working on lyrics for a second verse. And then we did a third verse. And he said, "Well, what about this? We got to do this. This term, there's got to be a pantomime, a Footlights pantomime." He started doing it, and we started writing and writing. And Emma and his girlfriend Katie were just watching us and thinking, "This is very strange. They haven't actually introduced each other. They didn't. They just sat down and started writing." And that's sort of how it happened. It was bizarre. And I do describe it as like love at first sight, a non-erotic love at first sight. You don't get more straight than Hugh Laurie, but it was like what would now be called a bromance, of course. But it was particularly centered around comedy, around a sense of humor, and a sense of humor, especially at a late adolescent, early manhood age. I say manhood advisedly. I think it involves something very deep about one's apprehension of the world. It's a kind of in or out. You either see the world the way I do, or you don't. If you don't, you're not the enemy. It's just we're not keyed into each other. We don't map onto each other. But adolescents are like that, aren't they? They share the same source. Right. Yeah, they find the same things pretentious. It's a very strong streak in the young is to be outraged by things that they regard as pretentious. When you get older, you don't mind so much, but when you're young, you think, "God, that's so pretentious." You get really upset by it, but it means you do lots of parodies of it as well. Anyway, so we just ended up. We started writing, and with Emma, I mean, we stayed the closest of friends, and I wrote with Emma and for Emma. We wrote some sketches for her, but the thing with Hugh was so close and so particular, and on stage together as well, that and Em was also more interested still in doing other acting besides comedy. So we did it, and we then did our show that traditionally from Cambridge goes to Edinburgh every year. And that year at Edinburgh, it so happened they had this new prize called the Perrier Award for the best comedy, which is still going and is still considered very important. And we won it. Amazing. We were astonished to have won it, because this was around the time of the birth of the stand-up. And we were old-fashioned sketch comedy.
Kind of like a two-man show. Was it a two-man sketch?
No, it was me, Hugh, Emma, Tony Slattery, who's a funny and brilliant performer who was a year below us, and two others as well. And and it was sketch comedy. So it was little scenes that we would do, someone knocking at the door, come in, and then there'd be a short sketch, whatever, rather than standing in front of a microphone saying, isn't life awful or isn't life funny? So we weren't stand-ups at all. It was always a fictional world that we were creating. But anyway, we won the award, and the BBC asked if they could put it on television. And then we were asked if we would tour Australia. And when we came back, we were asked to do a television series. And suddenly, Hugh claims he planned to join the Hong Kong police force because he'd heard that there was corruption there, and he wanted to go in and clean it out, like a kind of like Serpico, the Al Pacino movie Serpico, just be the one clean cop. It was a fantasy, but a very typical Hugh one. Otherwise, he would have joined the Secret Service, I think, because he was a natural James Bond.
Did you study at all with all of this going on? Was there any studying at Cambridge?
Not really. One of the huge advantages that we both had is we were both doing an arts degree, or at least, he was doing archaeology and anthropology, and I was doing English literature. And they don't involve having to go to lectures, and they don't involve having to know particular things. You just have to go into an examination room at the end of your last year and answer lots of questions with long essays. And I've always been very good at that. It's just like cheating. I have a facile mind rather than a scholastic one. So if asked to do an essay, I can just write and write and write. So I was very fortunate. Hugh went to one lecture in his entire 3 years.
Wow.
Something to do with exactly. And he turned that into a sketch because the lecture was about someone was showing slides about the Bantu people of Africa. And so he managed to make a sketch out of this anthropologian. So that's the advantage of Cambridge, is once they let you in, they assume that you're going to, you can look after yourself. It's very much a student-run place, Cambridge.
Right.
The academics and the graduates and the fellows of the colleges and the professors, whatever, get on with their world, and they do some teaching and all the rest of it. But the undergraduates run their drama clubs, and they run every other aspect of it. And it means you get experience. So at Cambridge, I was in well over 30 plays in front of paying audiences in the various drama clubs and things, which far more than anyone who went to drama school. So in that sense, it was a huge, but it was so lucky. And by coincidence, we didn't know we'd won this Perrier Award. We were on stage just finishing at one of the shows when suddenly the audience went a bit crazy. And they'd already applauded us. So we thought, what's the matter? We were literally checking our flies. And then we saw this figure coming from behind the stage. Excuse me. And it was Rowan Atkinson,
Okay.
who was already famous for his television series. And he was in a show called Not the 9 O'Clock News. And he was carrying this award. He said, I would just like to congratulate the Cambridge Footlights for winning. And we were like, oh my God. It was just, and little did we know we would go on to be such friends. And I was best man at Rowan's wedding. And he's, one of my closest and dearest friends, really. It's just bizarre how lucky we were, and to get all this, and Hugh and I were saying the other day, we're in touch all the time, and what if we had been at Cambridge, if everything had been, you asked that, that's how you asked the question, if I'd been born later, how would I have managed? Well, suppose I've been about to graduate in 2020. Let me think of all the students all over Britain, all over the world, who have a similar exciting group of friends with whom they're about to burst their talent into the world, only a pandemic arrives, which means that they can't even graduate together, and they certainly can't go to Edinburgh, and they can't be seen by others except by doing YouTube-y type stuff that just isn't the same. And we all weep for the young of today in terms of their ability to step out and stride into the world in the way that we were able to. And they must look at our generation and want to slit our throats when they realize how lucky we are. It's absurd.
There's I think for the students who can't, probably for the next few years can't enjoy that kind of campus experience, listening to you right now, if they are, can be particularly, torturous.
I would say so. Yeah.
No comedy club, none of that right now. Okay, so we have our first few questions that have come in, Stephen, since we are now 10 minutes to the end of the session.
Are we already? My goodness.
Yes, I mean, there's so much more to talk about.
I'll
I think
try
you have such a
answer
wide range of interests that I feel a 35-minute session doesn't do this justice. But
plus, I talk so much.
Okay, I think, no, Stephen, but before we get into the questions, I think it would be inhuman and cruel to kind of not talk about your prison episode. I think there are people waiting to hear about that because it is in the kind of description of this talk. So let's speak about that briefly, and then we'll get into the question. So how did Stephen Fry? We all know.
We all know. We either were ourselves, or we had friends or enemies at school who were difficult adolescents who would just couldn't conform, couldn't concentrate and focus in the classroom or in terms of behavior. And these days, they're often diagnosed as having attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. That diagnosis wasn't open when I was young. It's probably what I had. I was a nightmare as a teenager, as a young boy, and then as a teenager, and then as an adolescent.
Expelled from a couple of schools.
I got expelled from schools for breaking bounds, as they called it, for escaping, going to London, or stealing, all kinds of terrible things. I'd fallen in love, and that had messed with me completely. Of course, I hadn't expected it to hit me the way it did, and so after about the fourth educational establishment, I eventually left that, escaped to London, and one day was in a pub. And I was running out of money and thought I was going to have to sleep in the park, which I'd done before, or I was going to check on one of my school friends. But of course, in those days before mobile phones, that was a pretty difficult thing to do. You just have to try and remember where they lived and go to their street, But and it was a chilly night, so I stole a coat that was hanging in the pub. And I went out and started to sleep in the park. And then there was a lump in the jacket, and it was a wallet. And in the wallet were credit cards. So I went ape with these credit cards. I had it in my head, this is no excuse, but I had it in my head that it would be the bank that suffered from this, not the individual whose coat I'd taken, that he would report the coat stolen and the bank.
The coat, really? You hadn't set off to kind of take the wallet.
I hadn't, no, but nonetheless, it was an insane spree that I went on, staying in hotels, including the Ritz Hotel, and just going mad, buying suits, being absurd, smoking big cigars. I mean, I was 17 for heaven's sake.
How many years was it before you were kind of intercepted?
Well, I was intercepted in a town called Swindon in Wiltshire, and I didn't want to give my name away, so I refused to say who I was because I didn't want my parents to suffer any more than they had. But eventually, through a clever trick, they found out my name because they saw the various names scrawled on books that were in my luggage. And one of the names was Stephen Fry. And one of them came into the room while I was talking and just said, Stephen Fry, very quietly in the voice. And I turned around and said, yes. And they said, so that's the name. So then they discovered that I was on a missing persons list, and my parents got involved. But once I first went to court, they said I had to go on remand. I refused to have bail because I thought I didn't want my parents to pay bail. I thought I deserved to go to prison. But they had to wait because they needed the paperwork from 9 different counties in England to catch up with, so that they could make a list of charges against me, because I've been to so many. Oh, it was absurd, the whole thing. Honestly, it's weird looking back. It feels like someone else. So I went to this prison, which was a young person's institution, and for most of the time there, before I had pleaded, because I hadn't pleaded, you're counted as not guilty because you haven't yet pleaded, and so didn't have to do much. But then eventually, once the paperwork had been sorted, I went, pleaded guilty, had to go back to get a court date, and then I was a convict. And when I was a convict, I had to work and so on. And I found it very, I determined then. I said, this is absurd. I will. When I get out, whatever happens, if from prison or after prison, I will somehow get myself together, and I should still be young enough to get to Cambridge, which is the university I'd always wanted to go to. And I will work myself. I have to work in any job just to get enough money to get private tuition if that's what I need to get in, or just go to a library and study on my own. I absolutely made that vow to myself, partly because one of the things I did was teaching reading to a cellmate who was illiterate. And I was so shocked by the idea of someone of my age literally not being able to read. And I thought, what kind of ass am I? I've thrown away all these extraordinary opportunities I've had. And my love of language and learning was so profound and so much a part of me. And I was throwing that away. I thought, I cannot do that. This is my turning point. If I might get sentenced to prison, but I mustn't allow myself to get sucked into a life of crime or feeling like an outsider. So fortunately, I was put on probation, and I did go and study, and I got a scholarship to Cambridge, and everything seemed to turn around after that moment. I was very lucky.
Thanks for the story. So one of the questions we have here, Stephen, is from Sachdev Ramakrishna, and the references are lost on me, but I'm sure you know what it's about. He asks, what would you be more proud of, the birdlouse named after you, or being the last pipe smoker of the year?
It's a very good question. Well, as long as that birdlouse, which I was very honored when the whoever discovered it and was registering the taxonomical name for it asked my permission. I don't think they had to ask my permission, or perhaps you do, I don't know. But I thought, well, as long as that birdlouse doesn't become extinct, that is a guarantee of some form of immortality. Whereas I suppose being last pipe smoker, it's a weird thing. It's an old tradition in Britain that it was really the tobacco industry that started it to encourage people to keep smoking pipes. That prominent figures who smoked a pipe would be nominated. And so Harold Wilson, the Prime Minister in the 1960s, was Pipe Smoker of the Year. The comedian Eric Morecambe, who smoked a pipe sometimes. And I was, and as it happened, I was the last, because during the time I was holding this exalted position, they made illegal all forms of tobacco advertising and sponsorship, including the Pipe Smoker of the Year. So I was the last. But yeah, in answer to the question, I think I'm proudest of the pipe smoker.
Oh, good. Thanks for an honest answer. I mean, people are so diplomatic now that, thank you for that.
That's true.
Ria asks, it's Harry Potter's birthday today. And
so it is.
Doesn't think there have been. She doesn't think there's been anything more iconic than your readings of the Potter universe.
Oh.
So, would there be any chance of you doing a little bit of reading from that, or any other text you may have had at hand? I'm afraid, Ria, we might not have time for that right now. But I'm sure
I will tell a story though about. I'll tell a story about the reading to make up for it. When I started reading them, literally there was only one book. I had no knowledge there were going to be 7. I was just asked to do this children's book that was called Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, and I read it and thought it was rather good. And so I went to the studio and I met this young woman, Joanne Rowling, J.K. Rowling, and I started reading it, and she had. Despite the fact she'd only written one book, she was very convinced of one thing. She did not want to allow it to be in any way abridged or condensed. It had to be the whole text, word for word, because she felt some children might follow it on cassette, as it then was. And they'd be confused if it was different. So that's just put behind the story. Anyway, I think it was on the second one, The Chamber of Secrets. I hit a phrase. Sometimes I can read pages without making a mistake, and it can all go well. But I hit this phrase, 3-word phrase. Harry pocketed it. Still can't say it. Harry. I can say each word. I can say it backwards. It pocketed Harry, but Harry pocketed it. For some reason, I always put in an extra syllable. So the engineer and producer and I were laughing away as I was trying to get this phrase out. Jo Rowling wasn't there. But at lunchtime, I said to her, Jo, do you mind if I can't get this phrase out. We've had to abandon it. I'll do it at the end of the day. Harry pocketed it. Do you mind if I say instead, Harry put it in his pocket? And she said, no, you can't, with a grin in her voice that I could hear. So I eventually managed to say Harry pocketed it. And then in every single one of the next 5 books, Jo made sure the phrase Harry pocketed it appeared, just as a little booby trap for me. So
Okay. Stephen, there's a lovely question, and I think that might be one of our last, but it's a great question from Varshini Krishna Kumar. It has been proven that people who read books are more empathetic. However, these days, both empathy and the habit of reading are in decline. How do we tackle this?
That's such a good question. I think it is a natural corollary of reading empathy because you are entering the mind of another person. And I think part of the problem in our culture now is a misunderstanding of the word imagination. I think it gets confused with the word fantasy. Now, I'm not an enemy of fantasy fiction and fantasy cinema. It is the prevailing cultural mode of the moment. As we know, the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, dominates Hollywood and much of the world. But imagination is when you enter someone else's mind. It's not when you make up silly new kingdoms or superpowers. Imagination is when you enter the mind of someone else. You imagine being someone else. So a writer can be going through the paddy fields and look at someone stooping and imagine being them. Or, like Shakespeare, they can see a king or read about a king and imagine being that king. It doesn't matter what estate someone is in or how high or low, but it's just a facility, an ability to imagine being someone else. And with that imagination, of course, is sympathy, fellow feeling. Sympathy is the Greek for feeling together, or compassion is the Latin for the same phrase, fellow feeling. And empathy is when you feel inside something, you actually feel what they feel. And that's a trick that fiction allows. And you can do it in good cinema too. I don't feel it in fantasy cinema at all. I mean, you're sorry when someone gets hit and you think, ow, that must have hurt. But that's about as far as it goes. But when you actually feel what others feel, and what the answer is how to bring about a revolution in helping people feel for others, I can't answer. But I would urge you to think there is, and we don't have time to go into it, there is an argument against empathy, which is quite surprising because we all take it as absolutely as a guiding rule. But Rutger Bregman, the Dutch writer, I don't know if you're familiar with his work. He's just written a new book called Humankind, and it's quite a famous thing he does in which he demonstrates that the William Golding view of civilization is completely wrong. That actually, empirically, you can prove, because it has happened before, where school children have been left on a desert island and far from going feral, they actually looked after each other beautifully. So his whole book is about countering this idea that humans are at base Hobbesian, like Thomas Hobbes's idea of nasty, brutish, and short, the life of man being, but that actually we are together very, very naturally, kindly. But he includes in it a chapter called Against Empathy. And I don't have time to go into the arguments of it, but they're very interesting. And maybe he's a good guest for you to think about, because he's a fascinating man, and it's a very interesting book, because it's a deeply optimistic book about the human nature, hence the title, which is a kind of pun, Humankind. But it's also, there's a lot of counterintuitive things in it.
Okay, Stephen, I have a last question, which I think you might enjoy answering. It's, there's a big raging kind of debate about nepotism going on in India right now. And I'm being nepotistic and picking my husband's question, but he's a big fan. And we saw the hippopotamus together just last week in preparation for the session. So his question is, nearly 30 years after defining Jeeves and Wooster on screen, is it time you and Laurie went to Blandings Castle to play Galahad, Threepwood, and Lord Emsworth?
Oh, it's an interesting thought. I love that idea. For those not familiar, P.G. Wodehouse, who created Jeeves, the immaculate gentleman's gentleman, and his master, Bertie Wooster, whom Hugh Laurie played in the series I did with Hugh, he also created another world, the world of this fantastic castle in Shropshire, Blandings Castle, run by a dreamy, vacant, absent-minded peer, an earl, called Lord Emsworth, whose brother Galahad was tremendous fun. And they are magnificent books. They were tried on television a few years ago. In all honesty, it didn't quite work. And I think they tried to be too silly. I think people misunderstand Woodhouse and think he's all just silly asses going, oh, I say, what? But actually, it's the good-heartedness of the people. It's the kind of golden sunshine he pours over his world that makes him so immortal. And it is a very tempting and interesting thought, your husband. And thank him for, next time I'm chatting to Hugh, I'll say to him, what about it? What do you think? And well, because Hugh loves the Blandings books, absolutely adores them. So it's a very interesting idea. Thank you.
Great. All right. Okay. So we're time's up now. That's been told to me in capital letters in the chat window.
Oh, incidentally, I should just say I was very amused when Sanjoy introduced and said to Anand, if you happen to drop off, and then left a bit of a pause. And I thought, he's just suspecting that people are going to fall asleep. And of course, I realized that drop off has taken a new meaning in the world of Zoom, and he meant that their connection drops. I hope no one dropped off. Anyway.
No, we're both here for sure.
In either sense.
Sanjoy, it would be great if you could join us and kind of wrap up the session, and none of us dropped off, so that's great.
Thank you so much, Anindita, and thank you so much, Stephen. And yes, we keep dropping off, but not to Stephen. and to be cheeky, every time you stumble and picked a pocket, perhaps your psychologist could well take you back to the time that you could have done something mischievous. And I hope you paid that whoever the bloke whose pocket you picked at that point back for all the cigars and the Ritz. The Ritz! What were you thinking? The Ritz! Seriously?
No,
I mean,
I'm ashamed.
6 counties. Oh. And I suppose it'll become fashionable because you've done it. So you have to be super careful.
I hope not.
But thank you so much. And as Anindita said, it's impossible to sort of try and fit this into this new digital mode of you have to do it short and sweet. And we'd love to have this carry on forever. I was going to send you all a message saying time is stretchable. Don't get stuck in this idea of time.
I wish I knew.
But I would have got smacked by my colleagues. So me, like you, I'm only a performer. I only have a job to do. So I don't have any power, so to be. The power is behind the Zoom. So well, thank you both. That was absolutely amazing. And thank you all for, as usual, those wonderful, wonderful questions that you all research. And really, they're so considered. And that really keeps the excitement of this series going. Thank you to our radio partners, Red FM, Bajate Raho. And I do hope you're going to log back on at 8:30 p.m. for our next session, Bapsi Sidhwa, Between the Silences, in conversation with Urvashi Butalia. Celebrated novelist Bapsi Sidhwa speaks to writer and feminist publisher Urvashi Butalia about her creative journey across cultures, continents, and chronicles, and what she calls her Punjabi, Pakistani, Parsi roots. Her novels, Ice Candy Man and Water, were adapted by Deepa Mehta for the acclaimed films Earth and Water. This is at 8:30 p.m. See you soon.